Thanks for inviting me. And this is collaborative work with my student, Stephen Bennett, and a colleague, Aaron Benjamin, at University of Illinois. So my background is in cognitive science, mostly. I do a little bit of machine learning work. We've done a lot of experiments on how people learn and remember information. And this is a bit of a caricature, but a lot of experiments in psychology, the experimenter is in charge. The experimenter decides in the exact sequence of stimuli that somebody should learn from or remember. And the participant doesn't have a lot of control. The participant is basically passively absorbing the information for a later test. So in a lot of experiments on the wisdom of crowds, we randomly allocate people to different problems. People cannot self-allocate to problems that they would like to contribute to or that they have some skill in. And that has some limitations where we take the self-control out of experiments. And researchers now realize that we need to understand how people can self-direct, how people can have control over their own learning experience. So there's now a growing body of research on self-directed control in learning and memory. So here a participant can decide how long they want to study something, what stimuli to rehearse, and this produces all kinds of complications in terms of analyzing the data. But it's an important phenomenon to explain. Based on research in machine learning, we know that active learning can produce benefits, and similarly, active concept learning in the human domain also provides or demonstrates the benefits of active learning. So if people are in control of the stimuli to learn from, they typically do better. In a lot of experiments, a self-directed learner who is in control is contrasted with a yoked learner who gets the exact same sequence of stimuli but doesn't have control. And across many experiments, the result is that a self-directed learner has better memory, learns more than a yoked learner. And this difference is not just due to difference in motivation. It is more motivating to be in control. There's also an inherent information processing advantage when you are in control. So self-directed learning also relates to research on metacognition. So metacognition generally is your knowledge, the knowledge that you have about your own knowledge, your own learning. And this used to be a bit of a fringe area in psychology, but it's becoming more and more important. There's also more machine learning researchers who become interested in metacognition for intelligent systems. So one framework thinking about metacognition is the one provided by Nelson and Nierens. So they are, so in their theory, there's a metacognitive model, which is a mental model of some underlying cognitive process. And there are two processes. One is a monitoring process, where you're monitoring all kinds of signals of the underlying cognition. If I ask you a question, what's the capital of Australia? And then you might think about the answer, and if the answer comes to mind very quickly, then the speed of that retrieval, the fluency, can be used as a cue for confidence. And we're using all kinds of cues, all kinds of signals from a lower level cognitive process to drive our confidence judgments. Another important aspect of metacognition is controlling some process. So deciding on some strategy for learning, initiating some action, like study this, not that, or terminating an action, like stop studying this material. And my recent research interest is in how self-direction, how that's important on various online platforms. So some of our research is on forecasting, and we've designed some forecasting platforms where people come to forecast real-world events, and people typically control the questions that they contribute to. So there's a lot of self-direction on these platforms. And we also study how people self-direct their own learning on platforms like Lumosity, where people come to practice their skills in various cognitive domains. So users here can decide what items to answer. Users make decisions about when to study something, what to study, when to stop studying. And I'll present to you two case studies. The first case study relates to these forecasting platforms. And the question is, how does self-direction benefit crowd performance? Is this a good idea to have people choose the questions that they contribute to? And in the second case study, I'll talk about the self-directed learning on Lumosity. And I'll end with some discussion on, about the limits of human metacognition. So generally, I believe human metacognition is accurate, despite some claims in the literature, but there are some limits where we don't quite have an accurate mental model of ourselves. And feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. So a couple of years ago, I don't know if people know about the IARPA ACE program. This was a program funded by IARPA. This is the intelligence version of DARPA. So it's the Intelligence Advanced Research Project Activity. So they fund research related to intelligence analysis and forecasting. And they had this forecasting competition, the ACE program, in which teams were competing against each other to put together the best forecasting system. So each team had to get their own set of experts in various areas of world events, geopolitical expertise, to design their own platform where people can give a probability rating of where they think this is the probability that this event will happen in this time window. And then there was also a component of aggregating these judgments across forecasters and exploiting the wisdom of the crowds to come up with an accurate forecast. In the end, one team won, Team Good Judgment, led by Phil Tedlock. And there are many things that this team did very well, but they were able to put together teams, collaborative teams of very active forecasters. They call these super forecasters. These were the very best of the best forecasters that were motivating each other. They were very active in this as a team on a daily basis to produce accurate forecasts. So one feature on these platforms of the winning team as well as all the other teams is that forecasters chose their own questions to answer. And as a result, you see this a lot of variability in terms of forecasting activity. Some are quite active, some are less active. And the most active forecasters turned out to be also the most accurate ones. These super forecasters that I mentioned, those were the top 2% of forecasters. They were the most active. They answered almost all questions. And we looked at the pattern of questions that people were picking, and which questions you decide to answer is actually indicative of forecasting skill. So you can use this to exploit this to estimate skill. But one main question that wasn't addressed is, do these self-directed crowds work? Is it a good idea to let people self-direct to questions that they provide answers to? So this depends on metacognition. If people know their own skills and the metacognition is accurate, then perhaps it's a good idea to allow self-directed crowds. But we didn't know this in advance. There were some real questions. Maybe if people self-direct, then you remove some of the variability that you need in crowds. Maybe you let people, all the people that are drawn to a question, maybe they all have the same insights. So maybe you need more heterogeneity. Also, what happens if nobody chooses a question and you get very sparse crowds? It's also good to go back to Galton's original study. So all talks about the wisdom of crowds, they mention Galton's original study. because there's one important aspect of his study that gets overlooked. So he asked in his study people at a local fair to estimate the weight of an ox. And to his surprise, he found that the median or mean of estimates across several hundred people came very close to the true answer. And that crowd average was more accurate than the vast majority of the individual estimates. And that launched this whole area of the wisdom of crowds research. But unlike what most people think, the crowd was not a random sample. He didn't sort of randomly go and ask people like, what's your answer, what's your answer? There was an opt-in procedure. People paid to participate in this experiment. So we don't know if he achieved his results on the basis of this opt-in feature of the experiment. Maybe the people that didn't know anything about oxes or weights of oxes decided not to participate. So I'll report to you on some experiments we did where we allow sometimes people to opt in various different ways. Ideally, we would like to do this with forecasting because that's what we really care about in our work for IARPA. But for now, we'll do this with general knowledge questions. So we had 100 alternative forced choice questions in various domains of general knowledge: sports, math, geography. And we did these experiments on MTurk. People come to the experiment and they, in one condition, the opt-in condition, they select 25 out of 100 questions to answer. They read all the questions and then they can select 1 out of every 4 questions and produce an answer for those questions. In the control condition, the random condition, we randomly assign people to questions, so they have no control. Here's some example questions. Some questions are really quite easy. Are bets blind? What's the capital of Australia? And some are, well, I won't go over it, harder, requires some actual knowledge. And here is the raw data for the random condition. So I've organized the data here in terms of a matrix. So questions by participants. So each entry is an answer that people give if it's green or red. So green is a correct answer, red is an incorrect answer. And it's gray if people were not assigned the question. So there's not much of a pattern you can see here. But now contrast that with the opt-in condition. So I've sorted the questions here by popularity. So the most popular questions that a lot of people opted into are on the left, and the least popular questions on the right. So you can see there's a lot of green on the left, so people opt into questions that they know something about. On the right-hand side, there is a couple of questions, 7 questions, where nobody opted into. So in that case, we actually, in terms of the crowd performance, we actually flip a coin because we have no other strategy currently to deal with those missing answer questions.
Could you unpack what's going on with the popular questions that everyone gets wrong?
Yeah, it's difficult to get questions that are below ceiling. So we want to test crowd performance. So we want to make it very challenging at the individual level to get an answer correct. So we want to have a situation where the crowd, the majority vote, does well. So the student who picked these questions picked tricky questions. And some of them are so tricky that the majority of people get it wrong. That doesn't happen very often, right? There's a few bands of this redness.
But they're high confidence wrong because they opted into it, right?
That's right.
I see this in design courses too, where like lots of students will say like, "Oh, we should solve this problem," but then no one manages to come up with a good design about it. Like,
yeah.
It feels like honeypot. Like,
yeah. And in psychology, some of the work by Coriat, I don't know if you know this, there's a lot of focus on situations where confidence is somehow inversely correlated with accuracy. It gets a lot of attention, like, oh, people are so confident and they're wrong. Or in the domain of memory, there's an eyewitness who was so confident but misidentified the person, right? But if you look at the overall pattern of results, confidence is quite highly correlated with accuracy. And it goes wrong occasionally. Yes. So we score the crowds here by looking at majority rule. So the crowd answer is the answer associated with the majority answer of the individuals that opt in. And perhaps not surprisingly, we find that crowds in the opt-in condition perform better than in the random condition. Now, this works because people have reasonably accurate metacognition. People know what they know or don't know, so they opt into the questions that they know with some confidence that they're accurate. We also looked at fixed size crowds. If you sample the answers to equate for the differential crowd sizes, you still get an advantage for opt-in. So it's the underlying quality of the information that's better for opt-in crowds. In another experiment, we wanted to know what if we take this a little further. In the first experiment, people had a fixed amount of work. 25 answered 25 out of 100. What if we let people be in control of the amount of work that they need to do? We do this in MTurk, we still pay the same amount of money regardless of how many questions you decide to answer. And so the instruction is, you get this amount of money, feel free to answer all questions or no questions at all. And I thought this would be a waste of money because people can just opt out entirely and still be compensated. But we find wide individual differences. So here the matrix is organized from the very active individuals at the top to the people who opted out entirely at the bottom. There are two individuals who were clever. They said, okay, fine, I won't do anything then. And you can see sort of all kinds of strategies in between. The crowd performance was the same as in the previous experiment. It's not better or worse. So allowing people to self-regulate, it did not benefit or hurt performance, at least in this experiment. Yeah.
How much of this, like 80-ish% number, is being driven by, say, a large number of questions which relatively few people answer? Like, in some sense, you have a bunch of questions where you got a lot of data, and so that's going to be pretty robust. But I could easily imagine the stuff on the right third of that, for example, like questions is the x-axis, maybe having relatively few data points and then potentially being very sensitive to noise and perturbation of like one extra person got it wrong or right.
Yeah, so that there's some variability. It also depends on how exactly you measure crowd performance. Here it was 0, 1, so either the crowd gets it correct or incorrect. That leads to wide variability, especially for the questions on the right, right? Yeah, so I think this requires more experiments to really get a better sense of the stability of the results. Yeah. So I don't think that this is necessarily, that this generalizes across all circumstances. I think there are ways in which self-regulation can lead to better results. Yes. Yeah.
You know about Iowa electronic markets? Or like
a prediction market?
Yeah, there's all these betting sites for about 15 years that have done better at predicting candidate elections than polls.
Yes.
So the early confound was that a few people were putting a lot of money on it that had insider knowledge. And that was a question. And then the Iowa electronic markets does it with students. So it's a smaller bet, larger numbers. It's related to this. The question is like, how much is it crowd and how much is it expertise? So you see, if you're making money or you're paying to go, the idea is you may be good at guessing boxes weights, as opposed to just some weird way that crowds end up knowing better by average.
Yeah, so
there are two different benefits. One is the crowd and one is opting in and knowing something.
Right. So if you have no control over the people that are in the crowd, the larger crowds are better. Right? So you want to average over more and more people, and typically that produces benefits. For many of these cases, you need 30 or so individuals to do well. Depends on the type of problem. But if you do have some control over who is part of the crowd, in terms of opt-in right? You let people self-regulate, or people pay, which is another form of opt-in, then you don't need large crowds at all. Then small crowds can be quite effective. Yeah. And there's questions about how does this relate to prediction markets, and we don't quite have the comparison here. Yeah. Prediction markets, by the way, they have not fared very well in forecasting competitions. I know there's a lot of hype or buzz about prediction markets, that, but in all the comparisons that we've looked at, just simple opt-in strategies led to much better performance than a prediction market. Yeah. And then finally, one more experiment. Instead of a discrete sort of opt-in or opting out, we wanted to get a better sense of different strategies by having people generate confidence ratings. So now people answer all questions, all 100 questions, and they also give a confidence rating for each question. And based on the confidence, we can simulate, who will be part of the crowd. And these confidence ratings are on a scale from 50 to 100%, because it's a two alternative forced choice question. So here's the, again, the raw data, where the most confident individuals are at the top, and the questions for which people have a lot of confidence overall are on the left. But you can see there's a lot of differences between individuals and between questions. And now we can simulate different strategies to create crowds. So one strategy is to say, well, pick all the answers that are above X% confidence. Let's say I only accept all people, or I will let people continue to provide an answer if their confidence is above 0.75, let's say. Then you would get this answer pattern on the bottom. And now we can plot the performance of the crowd, that's on the vertical axis, against the proportion of judgments that are used on the horizontal axis. So if we set the criterion very low, let's say at 50%, then we accept everybody's answer. And we create these big crowds, and we use sort of 100% of all judgments. But if we become more strict and say, well, let's only accept people who produce confidence above 75, then you go up this line. And interestingly, smaller crowds with fewer people but more confident responses, they outperform larger crowds. Now, another strategy is to say, well, let's pick the X% most confident responses on a per person basis. So everybody does the same amount of work, and that's the red line. And you get roughly the same outcomes, but at some point these lines diverge. So it's possible that there are cases where there are strong individual differences, where some individuals just know a lot more than other individuals, and then having variable amount of work, where some people just produce a lot more answers than others, that can actually lead to better crowd performance. And then finally, we also looked at more realistic scenarios. Instead of opting in on a per question basis or giving confidence ratings for each individual question, which doesn't scale very well to larger platforms where you have to consider hundreds and hundreds of questions, what if you let people opt in for sets of questions related to some category of items? So here the questions in our data set were organized in various categories like climate change, earth sciences, life sciences, etc. And for each category, people also gave a confidence judgment. What's the probability that you'll answer a question in this category correctly? So now we can simulate opt-in strategy based on those confidence ratings, and that's given by the black line. So it's not quite as good as sort of individualized opt-in procedures, but we still find that if you restrict, if you only pick the answers from people who are confident about certain questions at the category level, we still find that you can form smaller crowds that are quite effective relative to sort of randomly composed crowds.
One thing that might help me understand, how big of an effect this is would be to look if you. I'm wondering sort of just what's the distribution of scores of individuals. So let's say you had me answer 100 questions, and you say, okay, this Geza got an 85%, Michael got a 64%. What's that distribution look like? Like, what's the mean? What's the standard deviation? Because a 10% difference could be tiny or huge depending on how hard this test is.
Yeah, so I won't talk about it here, but we estimated some psychometric models where we estimate the abilities for each individual person. So we get the hyperparameters on exactly what is your distribution of expertise? What is the expertise associated with the question?
Sure.
So we can model both the question differences as well as the individual.
So it's like an ITR model or something like that?
Yeah, yeah.
And so what did we learn from that? Like how
there are even for these sort of general knowledge domains, there are very big individual differences that you could exploit. There are some individuals who know a lot about a lot of different domains, something like general intelligence.
Maybe another way of asking the question then would be to say, in the Ox study, like the surprising thing in some sense was that yes, mean or median was very close to like basically the most accurate person in the room. I'm wondering, how accurate was the most accurate person in the room here?
Yeah, I don't have that. I think it's the usual. So as you know, if you go across questions, then chasing the expert is a bad idea.
Okay.
So if you've done well on one task, one particular problem, I can say, let's go with you again, because you did pretty well. That chasing the expert idea is a bad idea, because you might not do so well in the next problem. There is sort of a general expertise, sort of, right? So if you tend to be good at one problem, you might be good at other problems. It's still better to chase the crowd as opposed to the individuals in the crowd.
Right, yeah, I mean, what Sherrod-Goel's experiments found was that crowds are not more accurate on any individual question. They're just lower variance. Like they're sort of.
That's right. That's right. It's less risky to go with the crowd.
Right.
And it's difficult to identify the expert in advance, right? Post hoc, it's always easy, but in a true predictive fashion, it's very difficult to rely on individuals.
So you're saying if I took like the first 10 questions and then estimated quality based on that, and then tried to say, all right, you're my favorite course. I'm gonna pick you in the sweeps or something, then that's not going to go well.
Right, yeah.
So it sort of seems like you're saying that people are good at metacognition and you want to let people self-select. But are there any differences between like the experts or the novices in this? Is it just sort of that like everyone in general is good at doing that, or?
You're asking, is there differences in skill, metacognitive skill?
Yeah, for different parts of the crowd, right? Because.
It's possible. So for general knowledge, you probably are familiar enough with each domain to know what you know or don't know. But there might be limits. There might be domains where you think you know, but you actually don't. And there is such a thing as metacognitive skill. I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
I guess I'm just wondering if everyone generally is good at knowing when to opt in, or if it's just that like just experts are good at knowing when. I mean, it seems like everyone is good at
There's a bit of a
knowing
correlation that if you know a lot, you also know that you know a lot. And so the people who are less skilled also have poor metacognitive skill. And that's sort of the downside of this. Sometimes people opt in, they really shouldn't opt in.
It seems like that doesn't happen very often.
Not very often, yeah. But it's unclear how these results generalize to more complex domains like forecasting. So we believe that people can recognize their expertise in certain forecasting areas. But it can also go wrong. Yeah.
And are you worried about a Dunning-Kruger effect, basically, where like people have illusory superiority and just like they think they're better than they are if they're bad, but they think they're worse than they are if they're good, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe like novices aren't as good at doing metacognition, and I was wondering if you saw that in your experiments.
We'll have to look into that. Yeah. I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is a bit overplayed
Okay.
in the literature. Yeah. I'll talk about that at the end. Yeah.
I'm just curious if this data set is publicly available. It seems like a really nice data set, and there's a lot of different strategies people can try, like implementing and seeing how they like you're just presenting some, you know.
Yeah. Some I can point you to part of this data is published, and part of this data I can send to you.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So in ongoing work, and I would love to hear your ideas. We have this problem of what do you do with the unanswered questions, right? Because this does happen. And how do we create some crowdsourcing mechanism where somehow people come back to these unpopular questions and we get answers from them? And so we thought of several schemes, but maybe there are clever incentive schemes that we can think of to at least get some minimal crowd sizes for unpopular questions. There's also a big issue. I don't quite know how this will play out. What's the value of self-allocation versus machine-based allocation? In some areas, an algorithm might have sort of a big database to work with. It knows a lot about sort of individual differences. Might be able to estimate your expertise maybe better than yourself. And so maybe a machine should be in charge of allocating people to problems. In the forecasting domain, we've noticed that this is very difficult. For example, the super forecasters were identified after one whole years of forecasting. It took a long time to figure out who the good forecasters are. And so maybe self-allocation is still a good strategy, especially when time is important. And you just don't want to go through endless sort of questions that a machine algorithm is asking you to probe your expertise. So any questions about this part of the work before I continue?
Did you measure at all the effect that having to come up with a confidence score had on either people's likelihood to opt in or the accuracy of their answer?
Whether the confidence,
Like
the process itself?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Why do you think that would affect?
Well, I was thinking people, the act of opting in is sort of an implicit measurement of someone's confidence score.
That's right.
But then the cognitive task of putting a label on that confidence score might make people reevaluate their threshold for opting in or out.
Yeah, so these experiments were separate. Either in one experiment you opted in or not. In other experiments, you produced a confidence rating and you answered the question, regardless of what your confidence rating was.
And then,
But we can do more experiments along the lines you suggest, like, well, yeah.
but for the accuracy, I was just thinking that perhaps examining the confidence that you had in your answer might make someone change their answer or be more or less accurate.
It's possible. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. Yeah.
Sort of along the line of confidence, I wonder how much have been at play in terms of people being more aggressive, and they would choose a category or questions that they know that they may not answer it correctly, but they just want to take the risk, or they're just more confident in themselves. So how much would that have impacted the outcome of the study?
Yeah, so generally there's a problem of overconfidence. So if you look at the calibration curves where you look at the reported probability and you plot it against the actual probability of knowing something, people's reported probabilities, confidence levels are too high. So that is a bit of a problem. But the more important issue is, can people discriminate between the problems that they do or do not know something about? And so you can be systematically overconfident, but still realize that you know more about this domain than another domain. That's what we really care about. Yeah, the overconfidence adds some noise, but we can still use that as a signal. Yeah.
I'm wondering. Oh, sorry.
You almost answered this, I think, when a lot of the other questions were about confidence. You said there's a difference between knowing your domain or confidence. There's also I can't remember the name of the effect, overcompensating with confidence when you don't know and undercompensating when you do. What's that called again?
That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But
It's like who comes to office hours is the people that are doing well kind of problem. So the thing that's kind of interesting to me is like that all just seems like noise. I can imagine psychological reasons on both sides or on all sides where the participants, I mean, you can find out if it's noise. But the more interesting thing would be to treat these things almost as though they're a bunch of CPUs, totally separate from all of the psychology, and find the people that are actually super forecasters or what. So you said when you brought that up that it took a long time, right? But that's a feature of what you're forecasting. You could forecast much shorter questions, and the iteration period would be accelerated to find the forecasters. This used to happen in science fiction. People would want to know what happened in 100 years. Now it's like, can you even go 3? So you could shorten the period to farm the super forecasters.
That's
and
true.
then figure out if you could iterate. Because it seems like on some level you are trying to find people that are good at that.
Yes.
Even if people in this case is 50 processors or 1,000 processors. No matter what, the goal is to find out what set of this is good at it. Like add coefficients to the people who participate who are good at it so their answers are weighted more, like 538 does with polls or whatever.
Yeah, there were some peculiarities of this forecasting competition. We had to produce forecasts from the get-go. So problem comes up and forecasts need to be generated immediately for a problem.
Right.
So we didn't have time to identify experts. Right? So over several years we developed some methods to try to identify experts, but that took a lot of time. And then these methods started to pay off.
Right.
So in the meantime, it does help for people to self-identify the expertise. That's a better strategy than nothing. Right. I'm not saying it's the only strategy. Yeah. In the end, the big question is who has control? Right? Can you sort of control the problems that you want to contribute to, or is an algorithm saying, I want you to solve this problem. You are the expert. I think you should do this. And what is that balance of control?
But initially you need to trust them, but eventually it would just be like, I know what you're good at. The computer would be maybe better at, through the data, determining what you're good at.
Yeah, but
you see what I'm saying? Like eventually
That's
that
true.
knowledge would be owned by the machine instead
that's
of
true.
the person.
But the other thing with these platforms is user experience. Right? These are volunteers, or occasionally they're paid. We're moving to a paid model, but people don't like to be told what to do.
Right.
So having some control, even illusory control, benefits. Yeah, makes it fun. Yeah.
Well, so let's like dig into that design question, right? There's this trade-off of agency and perhaps whatever you want to call effectiveness. So like one study I really liked out of University of Minnesota in the last 2 years is they looked at what people are editing on Wikipedia versus server logs of what people are reading in Wikipedia. And there is a huge divergence in some topics where there's just a ton of demand, people trying to read articles, but no one's editing them, right? And you could say, hey everyone, I know you're not self-selecting to edit this article, but we really need help over here. Or you could say, well, maybe that's going to be lower quality if we ask people to do that, right? Because they're not self-selecting to edit the thing. So how do we navigate this trade-off? Like in principle, many of these platforms have to decide, are they going to try to nudge people to make edits to things they might not otherwise self-select into, or not? Based on your results, what would you recommend that we do as designers?
I don't think we know quite yet. We haven't done all the experiments yet, but I believe some soft nudges might be very helpful. The way some platforms like Duolingo uses various algorithms to nudge people to practice this skill some more and not this skill, because an algorithm knows like you're likely to forget. And I believe that's effective because the user is still in control, likes the whole experience, but then there's also the machine algorithm that provides some guidance. Yeah,
It's a hard problem.
it's a hard problem. Yeah, and I think we need more data. We honestly don't quite know what that balance is. Yeah. All right, I'll talk a little bit about the other line of work on lumosity. So a year ago, received some data from Lumosity, just up ahead in San Francisco. People come to this platform to train on various cognitive skills, memory, attention, problem solving. Here's one game that people play. It's called Ebb and Flow. It's task switching, so you have to decide which way the leaves are pointing when they're green and which way they're moving when they're orange. Sometimes the leaves can point this way but move the other way. That's confusing. And by a lot of practice, you can overcome this incongruency effect. In another task, it's a classic flanker task. You have to decide which direction is the center bird flying, ignoring the direction of the surrounding birds. And it goes very quick, but you're a little bit more confused if the directions are misaligned. And then this is the hardest task, I think. It's a two-back working memory task. You have to decide, is this card that you currently see on the right, is it matching the card that was shown 2 cards ago? And the cards are constantly shifting over to the left. So we have some data from a large group of users in the various age groups. So we have a lot of data to work with. And here's some learning curves. This is performance measured in terms of the number of correct decisions per gameplay. A gameplay lasts about 1 minute or so. And these are aggregate learning curves for different age groups and different games. So the younger users, not surprisingly, they perform better. They start at a higher level and they reach a higher asymptote. And the yellow line here is, it's a very large group of users, between 70 and 80 years of age. And sort of everybody's learning. But one important factor here is that people have control over when they stop practicing, when they stop playing the game. So you can see that there's the aggregate learning curves are more noisy on the right-hand side. There are fewer and fewer individuals contributing to this aggregate curve. So one question is, how's the learning different for people who decide to drop out early versus people that decide to train more? Is dropout, your decision to drop out, is that related to learning itself? If so, then we have to be very careful at modeling the learning process. So here's the aggregate learning for two different groups. The red line is for users who train over 100 games, practice for 100 games. And the blue group is for users that play some moderate amount, between 30 and 50 games. This is for that particular game, Lost in Migration, for this one age group, 20 to 30 years. And the learning curves lie on top of each other. Dropout is unrelated to learning itself. But as we start to look at other games and different age groups, we see that sometimes these learning curves do not overlap very well, especially for the older users. So for the older users, the people that drop out early, they're on a different learning trajectory. Their learning wasn't so fantastic to begin with, and they're on a more shallow learning trajectory. So maybe the reason that they drop out is because they realized they were doing badly, and that causes them to drop out. And this creates all kinds of complications for analyzing this learning data. So from a statistics point of view, the models that you need here are models where you have to worry about the missingness. That there's some learning data you never observed because the learner just stopped. And some of this missingness could be related to the learning process itself. Let's see. So we'll we're interested in trying to understand this dropout process, and we use survival models to try to predict the moment when you're most likely to drop out. So survival models model the probability that some singular event happens, like dropout. And we look here at survival models with time-varying coordinates, covariates. One factor we consider is the perceived performance by the user, and the other factor relates to the temporal lags between gameplays. So here's an actual learning curve of a single user, and this is very typical. Learning goes very well in the beginning, and then they reach an asymptote, and there's all kinds of random fluctuations over time. So maybe users are monitoring their own progress. They have a sense of increased performance over some window of time. And so they might be realizing, oh, things are maybe not going so well. And maybe that slope, the local slope of this learning curve could be a feature that's predictive of dropout. Another important feature for dropout is the temporal lags between successive gameplays. People start playing a game, they're excited, they play it a lot, and then their interest starts to lose a little bit, and so they play it less often. So we can look at the time elapsed between successive gameplays. Now, if we put these features in a predictive model, we find that demographics is somewhat predictive of dropout. We look at performance here in terms of AUC, the area under the curve. Can the model discriminate between events associated with a dropout, like this was the last game, versus events where people will continue on to the next game? And one factor that's predictive is ongoing performance, or people's perception of their ongoing performance. The other factor is what was the time between consecutive gameplays? If that gets longer, then you're more likely to drop out. And if you put all these factors together, then you can predict dropout reasonably well. Now, to complicate things a little bit more, the learning dynamics here is not just over successive gameplays. Learning occurs in sessions. So people play a game, they immediately play a game again, and at some point they stop the session, go on to the next session. And there's learning going on at various time scales. There's rapid learning within a session. At some point they stop, and then in the next session you get this warm-up decrement. Performance starts pretty low, and then they sort of warm up again to reach some level of performance. So previously we've modeled what's the likely point in time where you stop all practice, but you can also look at what's the time that you stop that session. And what's interesting is people tend to stop when they reach a certain high point. They reach some level of performance where they're satisfied with their own performance and then stop. It's sort of the inverse of stopping all practice. In fact, if you look at aggregate learning curves within a session, and if you tease them apart, how many games did people play within a session? You find that these curves do not line up very well. And so for example, in the middle panel, when people have trained between 4 and 6 sessions, the red line is for when people just play 2 games. And you see that when people play more games, their performance is actually below that of the other learning curve. So people tend to stop when they reach some criterion level of performance, whatever that is in their own minds. And that's yet another sort of complicated dynamic to consider in these learning models. All right. So I think I'll end with the discussion here. Are there any questions on the Lumosity data? Or we can postpone it until the end. So I've argued that human metacognition is mostly accurate, that we can exploit it to create better crowds, but there are some limits to metacognition. a mental model created by a learner might not always be accurate. There are cases where, let's say, students make the wrong decisions regarding their learning strategies. So we know that it's better to space out your learning of material rather than to mass your study. But when people have a choice, they tend to mass their study. They study the same material over and over again until that feels familiar. And so it could be that you're using heuristics to drive your learning strategies. When you mass study, you get this illusion that you are mastering the material, that things become more familiar, and then you might mistakenly believe that you will retain this knowledge. Whereas it's in fact much better to space it out, but it doesn't feel like you're learning, that you're acquiring knowledge at the same rate.
Do we know if people mass practice because they think it's more effective, or do they just do it out of convenience? Like you have a test the next day, you procrastinated.
Various studies show that if they believe it's more effective. Yeah.
Speaking to the Lumosity games, there's a really good paper called the Psychopsychology of Video Gaming Phasic Emotional Responses that shows that the highest point of emotional involvement is actually at the failure when they almost get it, which might suggest that then following the success, which isn't actually as emotionally involving, provides an emotional stepping out moment for people's play.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's another dimension to this. Yeah, that's
So you're saying
important.
it's not about the I finally did it. It's about the I was pissed off before and now
Yeah,
I'm happy.
that's actually the deepest degree of emotional involvement is, I almost had it. And then when people get it, they're like, what else you got? You know.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So just very quickly, I noticed on one of the charts that the lowest age group, 21 to 30 or whatever it was the only one which dropped out while it was doing better than the average. All the other ones, you got an example of them kind of quitting because they weren't good at it.
Yeah.
This would be related to what you just said, in the sense that, like, if you're a high-performing person on games or tests and you do well, it's, like, terrible. You know, like, so there's no thrill in it. You're like, I kind of know how this is working. What am I pointing at green arrows anyway? Like, so the game doesn't have high engagement inherently. It has high engagement for achievement, right? Like, weight rooms are pretty damn boring if you think about it, but because you can become strong, they become exciting. So you have a kind of achievement problem, whereas games that are just super fun but are low status and you would hide them from people, you become addicted to them in a different way. So there's a boredom because you're good at it, or there's a failure because you can't get the reward of feeling you're good at it.
That's right.
And they're actually very different emotions, just like this one is, which are probably key to a lot of the noise in your theory. You know, it's like people have different reasons for doing it.
Yeah, we should. The data that we have on Lumosity, it's large in size, but it's limited in scope. So we don't have the emotional perceptions. But it would be interesting to do some studies on that.
Well, if you consider Genova Chen's work with Chikatsumi-Hai's flow, he suggests that it's only when you're if it's too hard, you're filled with anxiety, and if you already have the anxiety of being afraid you're losing your mind, then that could just double down on the anxiety. But if you're strong, you get boredom. So technically, probably Lumosity should only be working with a certain skill level if they want to get flow states in the gameplay. Anyway, or maybe AI could adjust the difficulty level to the player. There's a lot of interesting possibilities in there.
Right. So these games, by the way, they're not. The difficulty level does not automatically adjust. That made our analysis a lot easier. Yeah. So another area where there might be issues with metacognition, this relates to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So there might be some misperceptions of people's skill relative to other people. Sometimes people interpret the Dunning-Kruger effect as that the people who have the worst skill, that they believe they're actually some of the best performing people, but it's not quite like that. There is overconfidence, but there's still a relationship between confidence and the ranking in the group. but there could be more overconfidence when you assess your skill relative to others than you assess your own skill relative to your skill in other domains. And some of you might know about the Bayesian truth serum. This is a crowd aggregation algorithm developed by Drees and Prelek, and that relies on metacognition of other people. So in the Bayesian truth serum, you ask not only what do you think the answer is, but you also ask the question, what do you think the percentage of people is who will endorse this answer? And then there's a mathematical procedure to combine this to create a good, a better answer. But there are serious questions of about whether the Bayesian truth serum actually works in some domains, because people might not know what other people know or don't know. And finally, one of the most interesting challenges is what are people's perceptions of their skill relative to algorithms? So we find more and more cases where people collaborate with technology, and there's complex issues of trust or mistrust, issues of algorithm aversion. So if you collaborate with some machine learning algorithm that's vastly superior to yourself, but you've noticed a couple of errors of this algorithm, then people tend to distrust it going forward, even though they really should rely on the algorithm. And we're dealing with this, and this is the last slide, in our current work. This is a new forecasting project funded by IARPA. We not only use human judgment in forecasting real-world events or forecasting, let's say, the price of gold, but we're also using machine judgment. And the goal is to come up with the best hybrid system to combine machine and human intelligence. And it gets really complicated. We're struggling with who should be in control. Currently on our platform, the human is in control. The human can look at a machine algorithm and say, okay, that's an interesting forecast, I'll copy that, or I ignore it. But there could be cases where this is a bad model, and the machine should really be in charge of the forecasting process, especially when it comes to questions like forecasting the price of gold. This is an area where machines do pretty well. And so I'll end there. Thank you.
Let's say that in the luminosity task, you're in an environment where you can adjust people's perceived learning rates, right? And you can do this in luminosity, right? You just adjust the difficulty ever so slightly without the learner noticing. Do you have any recommendations on like how you might maximize like retention/engagements given these like tools?
So messing with the perceived
Yes.
learning. Yeah, I'm not sure how to do this, right? So the whole point of the platform is you get a lot of feedback. Instant after a gameplay, you immediately see what your score is in various metrics. And you get a score of how well you're doing relative to other people. And people use it, right? That drives the engagement, knowing how well you're doing relative to other people. So manipulating those statistics, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question.
So I was really interested in this concept that we briefly touched on about the notion of a trick question, because in these predictive systems, we've sort of decided that the wisdom of the crowd is such that you can take the majority response, and with better than chance results, you're going to do well. Similarly, if the system were able to identify which of these questions are likely to fall into this class of trick questions, right, the red bands, you still have the information to make a good decision. You just need to understand that you should reject the majority response, right?
Yes.
That in these cases, if we can identify a trick question, we can still use the wisdom of the crowd. We just have to switch our model. So is there any, do you have any sort of existing work, or you've thought of ways that you might be able to predict and identify these trick questions?
Yeah, so the work by Drees and Prelek on the Bayesian truth serum was specifically designed to address that problem. So if let's say the question is, what's the capital of Australia, right? And most people mistakenly say Sydney, right? There's a few Australia experts that know it's Canberra, really. And I know that that's the correct answer, and I know that other people will be fooled. So then on the other question, like what do you think is the percentage of people who will endorse this answer? If there's a big discrepancy between your private answer and what you think other people will say, that can be a signal that maybe this is a trick question. But it's a very subtle, because you can also give the wrong answer and believe that you're the only person in the crowd. Right? It can also go the other way. This is why the Bayesian truth serum, I haven't seen very clear demonstrations yet that you can overcome this trick question problem. Yeah. But this is an important area for research. Yeah.
All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.